You're listening to the Churchosity Podcast, where we talk about the quality of being the church. Welcome to another episode of the Churchosity Podcast. I am your host, the Theological Coordinator. This is the show where we talk about the hard stuff, the tough stuff. We ask the questions that maybe a lot of Christians are afraid to ask, and sometimes even afraid to answer. But, as it says in 1 Timothy 1, verse 5, the goal of our instruction is love, from a pure heart and from a good conscience, and from a sincere faith. And riding co-pilot with me once again is my fabulous and amazing and outstanding co-host, the Mrs. Theological Coordinator, Andrea Brady, ladies and gentlemen.
Hi, everybody.
You're a little more enthusiastic to be here this time.
Well, I had a little vacation.
Yes, for those who don't know, my wife and I just returned from a fabulous vacation. We got away for 8 days. Eight glorious days in Walt Disney World for the very first time.
For the first time
time ever.
Yeah, it was really fun.
So I know that some people in our audience might be shocked that you and I have never been to Disney World because we're huge Disney buffs.
Yeah.
But it was a great time. We were celebrating 10 years of wedded bliss.
Yes. It was very fun.
Yes, it was very fun.
It was very fun, and,
Yeah.
But we needed it. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, it was a good time. And so we were able to record some eps before we left and not leave everybody hanging, so that was nice. But we're back in the saddle, continuing in our series, You Are Not Alone, talking about the subject of
spiritual abuse.
Spiritual abuse. We had a couple of heavy episodes.
Yeah, we did.
Where each of us got to share our stories.
It was nice to take a vacation after that.
Yeah, no doubt, right?
Whew. It was intense.
So, honey, when we talk about spiritual abuse, we're talking about somebody in the church that is a person of authority or influence in the church, or at least they perceive themselves as having some sort of spiritual authority or influence over another person in the church, and that person becomes the victim. Mm-hmm. They're more concerned about pushing some sort of an agenda or an ideology onto that person.
Mm-hmm. Or hiding their own faults.
Hiding the stuff that they're guilty of. Kind of like, that whole transference of guilt thing where, I'm up to mischief and I don't want anybody to know, so I'm going to put somebody else in the spotlight kind of a thing. And ultimately, it damages the relationship between the two, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's kind of like that's the payoff, treating somebody that way.
Yeah.
And we've talked about several of the different types of ripple effects of this type of behavior. That if you are a victim of spiritual abuse, it affects your relationship with your spouse. It affects your relationship with your kids, with your family, with your friendships inside and outside the church.
Right.
And ultimately, it leads to folks leaving the church altogether. Mm-hmm. And we've kind of done a fair amount of work here, unpacking a lot of examples of what we would consider spiritual abuse. We've talked about several different types of abusive leadership models, the narcissist leaders, the legalistic leaders, the misogynistic leaders. Mm-hmm. We talked about the different religious movements, different trends in the church that aren't gospel-centered but focus on other ways and means of doing church that can be abusive to people, especially if they don't agree with those things that are going on.
Right.
A lot of manipulation, a lot of spiritual and mental manipulation
and
going on.
Brainwashing, maybe?
Brainwashing, absolutely. Some cult-type behavior.
Yep.
Yeah. We talked extensively about our favorite subject.
I was just going to say that I really can have a lot to say about this partiality, neglectful, and preferential treatment.
I'd say that we had a lot to say about it, and I think we have a lot more that we could say about it.
There's a lot more that could be said, yeah.
Am I crazy, or does it seem like that might be the most prevalent form of spiritual abuse in the church?
I really do think so.
At least based on our experiences, anyway.
I would say that this topic, of partiality, neglectful, and preferential treatment has been in every church that I've ever been in.
Yeah.
On some level.
Some level, yeah. And we've given all different kinds of examples, talked about our own experiences, told our stories, and we understand that there are many other types of spiritual abuse that we haven't unveiled to the listening audience.
Right. Some I feel like I'm not qualified to talk about.
I would agree for myself as well.
Yeah.
There's things that I personally have not experienced. I've been witness to things, but I have not personally experienced them. And a lot of those things, I think if we brought them up or unpacked them, it would be major triggering for folks.
Yeah, I think so.
I think that there are just some forms of spiritual abuse that people don't enjoy reliving.
Mm-hmm.
And so we always like to do everything from a vantage point of love and having respect for our listeners especially. And because of that, we tread softly and want to be sensitive to that.
Right.
So it's important also, I think, that ladies and gentlemen listening understand what we're not talking about when we say spiritual abuse. We're not talking about a kind of one and done type of occurrence where somebody does something or says something that we don't like or that we're offended by.
Right. There's a big difference between being offended and being persecuted or victimized.
And being abused.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But when we talk about spiritual abuse, we're not talking about that initial moment where we're offended or hurt by something once. And, we wouldn't want to immediately label that as spiritual abuse because then we would slip into this victim mentality.
Right.
We kind of would have like very delicate skin,
mm-hmm.
Those could be over anything from a difference of opinion, a difference of doctrinal view, a ministry idea, etc. One thing that is very true in every church, besides the fact that there's no such thing as a perfect church, but in every church, there are differences of opinions.
Yeah.
There are differences of ministry ideas. I don't think that there's any real one size fits all for how to do church.
No, but I do think that everything should be done in love.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you have a difference of opinion, there's a right way and a wrong way to talk about it.
Correct.
People can be very rude.
Absolutely. And, the Apostle Paul, I believe it was in 1 Corinthians, it's either 12 or 14, said that everything in the church was to be done decently and in order.
Yeah.
So, but what we are talking about are prolonged patterns of behavior or treatment that do go on for lengthy periods of time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that both of our stories that we shared in the previous episodes were very demonstrative of what that kind of looks like.
Yeah.
And so, as we think about and talk about the subject of spiritual abuse, across the spectrum, there are all these different types of spiritual abuse. And it seems like everything kind of comes to a head in that the folks who are leaders or would deputize themselves as having a leadership role, they're the ones that tend to be the abusers.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like there is this attitude of, I have some sort of authority over you, whether I'm your pastor or I'm your elder or I'm your deacon or I'm in charge of the area of ministry that you serve in,
mm-hmm.
or we're in a one-on-one discipleship relationship and I've been a Christian longer than you have, or I've been at this church longer than you have, or I'm older than you are. Right?
Yeah.
So
Don't you just love it when you meet somebody at church and they give you their pedigree?
Oh, man.
That's what I'm, when I refer to generational Christians,
mm-hmm.
sometimes like, oh, I was born in this church, or my grandfather was a deacon or an elder, and my father was an elder and an associate pastor, who knows, and they just kind of give you their pedigree.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, oh, so you're kind of, posturing.
Right. Red flags.
Yeah, run.
Yeah, run.
I love to say run.
Pro tip.
Yeah.
If you are a well-seasoned and even generational Christian in your church,
mm-hmm.
and there's a new person that comes in and you feel compelled to go over and introduce yourself, do not give them your full disclosed resume of how special and important you think you are. Just a word of caution.
You cut them down to size, why don't you?
Well, glad I picked this church.
Yeah. You're so far behind at this point, you might as well just leave.
That's what it feels like
Yeah.
when a person says that kind of stuff.
It does.
Why are you even here?
Right? You cannot compete or compare.
Yeah. But seriously though, those are all just kind of different hypothetical examples of the ways that a person can assume a leadership or authority type role in another person's life. And they're the ones that are most often the abusers.
Right.
And so at the end of the day, there's a conversation that also needs to happen as to why this stuff keeps happening, why it keeps being prolonged. And essentially, at the very top of it is that these leaders, these persons of authority, these figureheads are getting away with the abuse because it's usually dismissed or it's excused. You know, honey, when we talk about spiritual abuse, we're essentially referring to people in leadership or influential positions within the local church that we attend and serve.
Right.
And it would seem that any other type of offensive behavior would be better classified as an offense and handled at the personal level.
Right, like
Where-
Matthew 18.
Or even Ephesians 5 and 6 that talks about being filled with the Spirit, and that if we're continuously being filled with the Spirit, that every earthly relationship that we have will be perfectly intact.
Right.
So then spiritual abuse is the abuse of one person's spiritual authority, or what is perceived as authority, over another assumed inferior person in the church.
Right.
And so, like we always say on this show, we ask the tough questions that a lot of Christians are afraid to ask. So I'm going to ask the question.
Yeah.
How does spiritual abuse get prolonged?
Oh, geez. Yeah.
And so right off the top, the first thing that comes to mind is that the abuser is kept hidden or protected. And of course, as I say that, immediately what pops into my head is a lot of the stuff that you see in the news, a lot of the stuff that pops up on social media, like celebrity pastors. And it seems like 2020 and the first part of 2021 were not good years for celebrity pastors and ministry heads.
No.
And I'm not going to name names, but if you're paying attention at all, you know who I'm talking about.
Right.
Those guys were guilty of specific areas of spiritual abuse that we haven't talked about, but they were very well protected. So those people's forms of abuse were kept hidden. And I know of a handful of instances because I, fumble around on Twitter. I know of several of these guys whose areas of spiritual abuse and sin were so well protected and so well hidden that they've actually been allowed to flip it around and make the victim the bad guy because they finally said, enough, I'm exposing this.
So you're saying that the abusers, or like these celebrity pastors in this instance, had surrounded themselves with people that actually knew what was really going on? But
Absolutely.
They set up like a bubble around them to protect them?
Yeah. They surrounded themselves with a bunch of yes men, and they surrounded themselves with people that would just look the other way.
How can those people sleep at night?
I don't even know, man. Like, seriously. I mean, we could go off on a rabbit trail and talk about the conviction of the Holy Spirit.
Well,
and
they
the
must have been
discipline.
getting paid.
That's deep.
I'm sorry. They must have been getting paid because...
It wouldn't be about money, would it?
Oh, I think maybe.
Oh, man. Yeah, you put enough zeros behind those commas and I'll keep quiet.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting.
That, or if they didn't have that job, where else would they work?
Right. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when we do practice to deceive. I mean, it's, habitual sin and spiritual abuse can be perpetuated and prolonged for such a long time that when it finally is exposed, you're barely scratching the surface when you find out what these people were up to.
Right. It's like an onion. It's
Yeah.
got layers.
And it seems like it just gets worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
And the flip side of that same coin
Yeah.
of how the abuse gets prolonged is that the victim isn't believed or supported.
Right.
So you don't even have to be a celebrity pastor. You could be a local guy and somebody outs you. Well, they're not going to believe you. And they're certainly not going to support you.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm talking about here. That's how it gets prolonged. And so when spiritual abuse is prolonged, it also produces more victims because they just keep getting away with it.
Right.
Let's say that the victim does go to the pastor. Let's say somebody in the church is spiritually abusing another person in the church.
Right.
And that victim doesn't know where to go. So they go to the pastor. They bring it to the pastor. And so often that behavior
Is excused.
is excused.
Yeah. No kidding. Oh, that's just how they are.
It's just how they are.
Yeah. Like, it's just a difference of personality, or, you're just supposed to make an allowance for their differences.
Right.
Isn't there a Bible verse about that?
Yeah, it's in Romans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the differences aren't differences of opinion. Their differences could be bad and abusive behavior.
Right.
Like, I'm not supposed to make allowances for that.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah. I don't think that there is a chapter or verse in the Bible that tells you that as a Christian you're supposed to be the spiritual doormat for somebody. There's a
Right.
difference between making an allowance for other people's differences and expected to put up with their crap.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know of an example of someone who was just a rude person. And they...
Only one?
Well, one in my mind that
Okay.
I'm thinking of. That
I'm sorry I interrupted
They
you.
were just a very rude person. And anytime that they had a difference of opinion, they were very rude about it. And I'm just thinking, it must be fun being married to that person.
Ouch.
I mean, there's no love there.
Right.
It's really sad.
Yeah.
Oh, but that's just how they are, so we all have to endure it
Yeah.
somehow, for some reason.
It's almost as if these folks in positions of influence or leadership or authority who are abusing people are forgetting that we're all sheep.
Yeah.
Even them. We're all literally on the same level playing field with God.
Right.
And it's like the rules somehow don't apply to the abuser. They have this attitude like, I am above the law. I am protected. It seems like the higher up of a position that person has, the more they think they have freedom to do whatever they want.
I can think of some celebrity pastors that are like that have been
I
like
can
that.
think, yeah.
Yeah.
I can think of denominations that promote this. Yeah. But I'm not going to go there.
No.
Remember, the goal of our instruction is love.
Right. Well, it's up to the listener to scrutinize
Yes.
and discern based on the information they're given and, reading their Bible and praying,
Exactly. I mean, the Lord does give instruction through Scripture and through circumstance. And you're absolutely right. There is this two-sided coin that is a huge problem that really almost never gets talked about when it comes to spiritual abuse and how it gets prolonged. On one side of that coin is this lie that you're expendable.
Oh, you mean like children's ministers are a dime a dozen?
Right. Yeah. Anybody out there heard that said to them before? Yeah, children's ministry workers are a dime a dozen. And in context of this comment is somebody who is labeled as stirring up trouble because they want to confront the spiritual abuse that they're being forced to endure. And so a person in authority, a person in leadership doesn't want to hear about it. And so they say, well, we're just going to have to let you go because, the role that you're in, we'll just find somebody else.
Yeah.
You got a church building full of warm bodies and we'll just grab the next guy or gal to fill your spot.
Right.
It's no big deal. It's kind of like, back in the days when I used to be a fast food manager, we were always taught that if you didn't like an employee or they were an unsatisfactory employee and you had no grounds for termination, you just start cutting their hours. And eventually they'd get sick of it and they'd quit because they're not getting enough hours.
Right.
It's the same kind of mentality.
Well, I have to also say, I mean, I know of churches that are huge and they actually like interview and scrutinize people, like let's just say for hospitality, welcoming.
Right.
And if you're not young and perky and good looking enough, you don't qualify. And I know of churches who have done what you just said, start cutting the hours of some of the older generation who love serving, maybe are very, very good at hospitality, but they aren't, fresh.
Yeah.
This really upsets me.
Yeah, I have to share a quick little story.
Yeah.
This just reminded me of something. In one of my previous churches, I was responsible for the greeters at the front door and at the sanctuary door. It was one of my areas of responsibility. And there was a gal who was on my team that was probably, how do I say this?
She's a senior citizen.
She was a senior citizen. And I just loved her. You know who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I just loved this gal so much. And she was one of those people. She was a widow, and she'd been in the church for so long. And like a lot of folks, like ourselves, she wore a lot of hats. And she just got so much joy out of serving in the church. And she was busy, like every Sunday. Like she put me to shame. Like she was old enough to be my grandmother, and she made me look like a weakling.
Yeah.
And not to mention, she was like 1/3 my size. I was so impressed and in admiration of this gal. And so I thought in my wisdom that I would
wisdom, quote unquote wisdom.
Right. I thought in my finite wisdom that it would be a good thing for me to give her a Sunday off.
Oh.
Let me tell you.
You foolish young man.
I know. After I put the schedule out and she saw that she didn't have this usual week on the greeting team, she pulled me aside after church and was like, "You listen here, young man.
You whippersnapper.
You young whippersnapper. The church is my home. The church is my family. Don't you dare take me away. Or don't you dare take my service away from me."
Ooh.
And, so like I didn't do this on purpose, right? But there are people in the church that do that on purpose.
Yeah.
And the idea behind that is to phase out the old guard and promote the younger new guard, right? It's pretty crazy. Pretty crazy.
Yeah.
So, there's this lie of being expendable.
Right.
But then on the flip side, there's this lie of being non-expendable.
Right. Like if you're in charge of PowerPoint, you're totally not expendable.
Oh yeah, you got job security, man. You got job security. And so if you are a person in a non-expendable role or position,
people bend over backwards for you.
and if any accusation about you being spiritually abusive ever comes out, they're going to bury that. They're going to hide that. All of it is because somewhere along the way, someone is trying to seize an opportunity to gain power in the church. And it's done through the tool of spiritual abuse. Yeah. And these are two huge problems that nobody talks about.
Yeah. We're all on the same level playing field.
Yeah, exactly.
We're all expendable, really.
We're all expendable. That's the truth. We are all expendable because at any moment in time, God could take any one of us in ministry anywhere and say, "You know what? You need to spend some time on the shelf."
Yeah.
And we don't have any control over that.
Right.
But it gets tough, the spiritual abuse that gets prolonged, it goes on for so long for all of these reasons,
Well, I know one more thing that I think one reason that spiritual abuse was prolonged because of, I hate to say this, it sounds really terrible, but I think in some part my faith clouded my judgment.
Ooh. Ooh.
I know that sounds really awful.
No, I hear what you're saying, but that might go over somebody's head. So unpack that a little.
My faith clouded my judgment. And I think, in one of the examples from the church that we were unhappy with, I wanted it to work out so much, but there were so many problems with the people in the church. And I had faith because these people were supposedly Christians. I would just assume that it would be God's will that we all get along.
Well, it is God's will that we all get along with each other. So
Right.
it's easy to think that.
So I kept praying, that he would work it out somehow. But the abuse was prolonged that way because I kept thinking God would move mountains because, I had faith that he could.
The old faith like a mustard seed analogy.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I felt like I was being noble, like I was fighting the evil forces, but really what I was doing was enabling the abuse and prolonging it just because I had faith that God could turn this all around and change things.
Right. If
it be his will, which
Right.
I assumed it would be because I would think that God would want us to work things out and work together, but it didn't.
And isn't it amazing, sweetheart, how spiritual abuse takes faith out of the equation because your judgment is so clouded?
Yeah.
Because you're absolutely right. Every point that you made is absolutely right. Because we're Christians, we're supposed to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Because we're Christians, we're supposed to do all that is within you to be at peace with all men.
Right.
We're supposed to have this attitude of joy in the ministry. And yet, every day you go to work or every Sunday you go to church, and it's problem after problem after problem after problem. And in the back of your mind, you know what those verses are saying. And so you hold on to this mustard seed-like faith and believe that, God's going to work it all out and everything is going to be fine. And yet, that isn't what happens.
Right.
And really, way back at the beginning of the problems, it should have been more clear. We should have had better judgment that, this is huge red flag. We probably shouldn't be here.
Right. Sometimes God has to hit me upside the head with a 2x4
You're not the only one.
to get my attention.
Yeah.
And sometimes I still don't listen.
Right. Well, I think we're all guilty of that, sweetheart. Because of the sensitivity of the subject of spiritual abuse, it just doesn't get talked about enough. And so, again, I'm going to ask a hard question. Why don't we talk about this stuff? Why not? Because I don't think that there's a single person listening right now that has no idea what we're talking about.
No, I think most people do.
I think most everybody that's listening is going, there was this one time. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Or, oh my gosh, I know exactly what you're talking about. That happened to me. Oh, I wish I would have known. That kind of a thing.
And sometimes in retrospect, looking back, you can see all the red flags.
Oh, I know.
I know.
Isn't it just horrible?
I think a lot of the times we don't talk about this stuff because it's embarrassing.
It's embarrassing?
Yeah.
Depending on the type of abuse, yeah.
Yeah. And, I don't like to cause a problem.
You don't want to be that Christian.
That guy.
You don't want to be that guy. You don't want to be that gal.
I like to be the person who edifies. I like to be the person who builds people up. And when you bring up a problem doesn't feel like it's edifying. I don't know.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I think that a reason why we don't talk about this stuff is because we don't think people will believe us.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think some people make themselves out to be such a high and mighty, wonderful Christian that, oh my goodness, I can't believe that they would do something so terrible.
Yeah, there's no way that so-and-so could ever do that. Yeah.
If you ever think that about somebody, you need to check yourself.
Take heed.
Take heed.
Yeah.
Because, really, so-and-so would never. Well.
Yeah, or maybe we're labeled as overreacting. If we start talking about
you're too sensitive.
Oh, you're too sensitive. You're overreacting.
They didn't really mean that. They didn't mean it that way. You must be interpreting it wrong.
Or being confrontational, addressing the issue. It's not the Christian thing to do.
Or you could be seen as pugnacious.
Yeah.
God forbid. That's a sin.
Yeah, pugnacious is a
I'm
fancy
sorry,
word.
that's bad.
Pugnacious is a fancy word in the qualifications for elders that literally means someone who enjoys picking fights or causing brawls.
Yeah, stirring up trouble.
Yeah, it's like, what kind of mischief can I cause now? Like, you get off on it, you know?
The same kind of salivating some people get over gossip.
Right.
It's the same kind of salivating they might get over stirring up trouble.
Yeah.
You know.
And I think another reason why people don't talk about spiritual abuse is because if they go to someone and that person might turn around and say, well, are you following the proper Matthew 18 protocol?
Oh.
The infamous church discipline protocol.
Right.
And again, we're not talking about when somebody offends another person.
Yeah.
We're talking about perpetuated
Abuse. Yeah.
that is not going away.
Well, I think a lot of the time people point to Matthew 18 as kind of like a cop-out.
Yeah, they passed the buck.
Yeah.
Well, did you confront them?
Right.
How many times?
Right. Okay.
What's the next step?
Well, I mean, not to be flippant, because Matthew 18, there is a time and place for that. But when somebody's being an abuser,
right,
that's another level. That's on another level,
yeah,
in my opinion.
And I think that, sometimes spiritual abuse, the spiritual abuse that you're suffering can get to the point where you just start to lose hope that it's ever going to get better. Mm-hmm. And so you don't talk about it because you're wondering, like, what do I do now? Mm-hmm. Who or what resources do I go to? You and I say all the time, these types of things happen in every church.
Right.
So another reason why we might not talk about this stuff is because it's just inevitable.
Well, if you talk about it, maybe you're gossiping.
Right.
I mean, do you see how we get put in a box?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, we seriously get put into a box. And it's very difficult to even know what to do at all, because you do one thing. Oh, are you doing it this way? If you do it a different way, oh, that's incorrect. That's sinful. I mean...
Yeah,
and here you are, you're the victim, and there's nowhere to where do you go?
Right.
What do you do?
And ultimately, the victim
mm-hmm.
is not opening up about the spiritual abuse so that they can be a gossip monger.
No.
They're not opening up about the spiritual abuse because they want to cause a problem.
No.
They're opening up about the spiritual abuse because they want it to stop.
Exactly.
And if you can't trust the leadership in your church, if you can't trust the person in charge of your area of ministry, if you can't believe that those people got your back, then there's no hope. Mm-hmm. Right? Ooh, you want me to get real savage?
What?
How about this? NDAs.
Oh.
Non-disclosure agreements. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, those are handwritten forms of spiritual abuse. If you are in a church that requires you to sign a non-disclosure agreement,
run.
Check, please. Deuces, I'm out.
That's kind of scary.
What in the world kind of an operation are you running?
Right.
Under the guise of church and ministry, when you got to have somebody sign a non-disclosure agreement so that nobody knows about the crap that's going on.
Are you familiar with any times when a church has asked for someone to sign a non-disclosure agreement?
Okay, so yes, I have personally been asked to sign one.
Ooh.
And I've refused, and I literally tore it up right in front of the person.
Okay.
I have been, you and I both have been faced, we talked about it in our stories, that you and I have been gagged verbally, or what
Not
they call
legally,
a gentleman's agreement.
Right.
And I know right now, I know of 3 churches off the top of my head that I'm not going to name that require every single person on staff and every single person who becomes part of membership in the church to sign an NDA. Because in those church business models, because that's what they are, in those church business models, when those people join the membership, they're joining the membership because it's a prerequisite to serve in ministry.
Right.
And so if you're serving in ministry, it's like what happens in Vegas.
Oh, man.
It's it's very cultish, and you're signing on the dotted line, and eventually...
So, I'm going to know stuff. And when I know stuff, I can't repeat it.
Exactly.
Oh,
And you got to sign a piece of paper agreeing to keep your mouth shut.
I see.
You could know about some of the most horrendous, dark things going on in a church, and you can't say a word. And I'm not talking about confessional law.
That must be a
Different
fun
conversation.
experience.
What's that?
That must be a fun experience.
Well,
I'm being
here's what I will
sarcastic.
tell you. Here's what I will tell you.
What?
The culture revolving around, the attitude, the atmosphere revolving around an NDA in these churches is spun as a positive thing because you got a seat at the table.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, oh, at long last.
I suppose you could talk amongst yourselves.
Well, sure. And I'll bet you that there's a lot of conversations going on behind closed doors in private meetings because that's the only way that you can get that stuff off your chest.
Wow.
Imagine, if you will,
Yeah.
you and I are married and we go to a church that does this.
Right.
And I want to go into ministry, but you don't.
Oh.
So I become a member
So you know stuff.
and I know stuff and I sign a piece of paper and I see and know stuff and I can't talk to you about it.
Well, you're not supposed to.
Or I'm not supposed to.
Right. Oh, my goodness. That's divisive.
Right. But this is spiritual abuse.
Yeah.
It's a form of spiritual abuse.
Okay.
It's and we're kind of getting off the rails here a little.
We
But
are.
the bottom line is that it's almost as if spiritual abuse has just, simply put, become the norm in church culture. It happens everywhere. It's going to happen everywhere. So why are we surprised, right? That's the norm. Again, hard, tough question. Why does this have to be the norm? Everything that we're talking about is the norm. I hear it time and time and time again. This stuff is going to happen, and when it does,
Yeah.
here's how it should be handled. It's kind of like you and I had a conversation, in regards to culture and our kids. That it is normal, it is the norm, it is acceptable that all teenagers, generation after generation after generation,
Are rebellious.
and make horrible choices.
Yeah.
They deal with alcohol and drugs and premarital sex and you name it.
And rock and roll.
Every generation has their own version of this, but it is
Yeah.
the norm that teenagers are going to make bad choices. And so we're supposed to kind of just accept that it's inevitable and somewhat look the other way. Why does that have to be the norm? Why can't we change the narrative? So I asked the question, why does spiritual abuse in the church have to be the norm? Why can't we change the narrative? Why can't we put our foot down and say, no, we're not going to let this crap happen. We're going to start labeling leaders as disqualified. We're going to start disciplining people out of the church like Matthew 18 says you're supposed to do. And we're going to actually come alongside, disciple, protect, and serve people who are victims of this stuff.
Yeah.
Why can't that be the narrative?
I don't know.
Because
We're fallen.
maybe. But
I mean, it sounds wonderful, and that's how I'd love to be in a church like that.
so would I.
Yeah.
Because you know what? When
What?
spiritual abusers are given the ability to continue abusing or continue denying the allegations or continue to hide the abuse from sight, there comes a point where that victim, their only option is to leave.
Yeah.
And,
Guess what?
and ladies and gentlemen, churches are emptying.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that. Yeah.
Churches are emptying out in droves, and it has nothing to do with COVID.
No.
I think COVID's become a convenient assistance to it.
Yeah.
But this is the moment where Jesus literally becomes all that you need. He literally becomes all that you have, because this is the point when the healing is just not going to happen at your church. It just won't, because it feels like the abusers are just going to get away with it. And so we're going to have an episode coming up where we talk about the aftermath of spiritual abuse, what happens when a person does have to make that choice, that very, very hard choice to leave their church.
Right.
But
sad.
It is, but one of the many consequences of spiritual abuse getting to this point is that it makes it incredibly difficult to trust church people ever again.
Yeah. I know a lot of people that don't go to church anymore because
me
they've
too.
been abused.
For years.
Right.
And
I mean, it does take time to heal.
yeah, and sometimes it takes a very, very long time to heal, depending on what the abuse was. And the things that trigger those feelings. Like we've talked about sounds and smells even, that bring it all right back again. And so we're sensitive to that. And one of the things that seems to be common in part of the conversation of spiritual abuse, when somebody leaves a church, there is this attitude of trying to convince that person that they need to get right back in the game, that they need to get right back into church again.
I see.
And so think about it this way. You would never expect a victim of abuse, and I don't mean spiritual abuse, I mean abuse.
Like abusive relationship?
Yeah, like okay. Let's put it this way. Let's say that you have a husband and wife that have been married for quite a while, and the wife comes to the pastor and says, my husband's been physically abusing me for a while now. It came out of nowhere, and I can't deal with this anymore. I need your help.
Right.
And so the pastor, now you're going to laugh. I know you are.
What?
Because of how ridiculous this is going to sound. But
Okay.
just go with me here.
Okay.
The pastor then looks at this wife who's being physically abused by her husband and says, well, have you confronted him?
Well, duh.
Have you confronted him?
Okay.
Which, of course, she's going to say,
Well, yeah.
Well, what's the next step?
Buy a rolling pin.
So you see where I'm going with this, right? Whoever the person is that wife has gone to ask for help, to seek support because of her abusive spouse, is not going to give her what she needs. They're going to turn her away. They're not going to take it seriously. They might even say, Joe so-and-so, I could never imagine him doing this to somebody. Maybe you just won out. Who knows, right? All of the different ways that thing can be spun. And then let's say that this goes on for 2.5 years.
Yikes.
And one day that person gets a phone call that wife is now in the hospital.
Right.
She's been physically abused to the point where she's in the hospital now. And now all of a sudden we're going to take it seriously, right? And to however they choose to handle it. But the point is, you would never tell that woman you need to get right back into your relationship with your husband.
No.
And you would never, let's say that it got to the point where that woman said, I'm going to divorce this man.
Right.
You would never tell that woman while the ink is still drying on her divorce papers. You need to get right back out there and start dating again. Now, it sounds ridiculous.
Yeah.
But essentially, when you have someone who has been spiritually abused for a prolonged period of time, so much so that the only option that they could come to is, I have to leave this church. You would never expect that abuse victim to just go rushing right back into an abusive relationship. You would never expect them to just go right out there and find a church and just start trusting Christians and church people all over again.
Yeah. I mean, there is no one size fits all.
No, there's not.
Some people might feel they need to do that, and there's nothing wrong with that either.
Well, depending on the person and depending on the type of abuse. But what I'm saying is that should not be the expectation.
Yeah, you can't expect everyone to be the same.
Because ultimately, we do want to be in fellowship with other Christians.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we do want to be worshiping in church on the Lord's Day corporately. And yet, there are some forms, and I would argue there are most forms of spiritual abuse that kind of drive a wedge between the victim and the church when it has gone on for so long and been prolonged. Listen, when a person has to make the choice, the hard choice, to leave their church, that spiritual abuse situation is terrible.
Right.
And they're not chomping at the bit to go diving headfirst into another potential abuse situation. And so where it gets really unfortunate and dicey for that victim is when they hear messages like, you need to not avoid going to church.
Like you're in sin?
Yeah, you're in sin for not being in church on a Sunday morning. I know that your situation prior to this sucked, but you are being selfish and you are being sinful if you are not in church with other believers in Jesus Christ on the Lord's Day. It's almost like you're beating up sheep that have already been beaten up.
Right.
When your church has cultivated an abusive atmosphere and the abuse runs freely because, well, it's the norm, after all, eventually people are going to get up and leave. And the go-to reaction cannot be trying to guilt people back into church. And I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, there is a verse that people just need to almost forget exists in the Bible right now. Because it is so grossly misappropriated. And that is Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, that says that we are to not forsake our own assembling together, as is the habit of some.
Okay.
This verse far too often is spun in a matter of guilting people into going to church, even though it's not safe for them to go to church. It's
Well, I've heard this verse quoted a lot during COVID
oh, I'm sure. Yeah, me too.
because some people were vulnerable, or maybe they didn't feel comfortable going and assembling together because of COVID.
Right.
And yet that was thrown in their face like they're sinful, horrible people for
Right.
wanting to protect the sanctity of life,
Right.
of their own life.
Yeah. Different conversation, different episode.
Oh, okay, good. We can have an episode about that.
Yeah.
That sounds exciting.
Yeah. But what's interesting about this verse is, you know me, I'm a context guy. So let's read what the whole verse says.
Okay.
Not forsaking our own assembly together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near.
I'd say the day's drawing near.
Yeah, but if you read that verse as a whole,
Right.
it says something a little bit different than just the snippet that gets thrown in people's faces for not going to church on
Gathering
Sunday.
together so they can encourage each other.
Yeah, let's gather together so we can encourage one another.
Oh, okay.
I'm not going to gather together because I feel guilty for not being there.
Right.
Oh, wait, it gets better. Let's back up again. Let's read the verse before this.
Okay.
And let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembly together.
Okay.
That says an even broader and even more different.
So we're supposed to stimulate each other to love and good deeds,
By doing what?
assembling together and encouraging each other.
Right.
Okay.
We're not assembling out of guilt.
No.
We're assembling because we want to encourage one another and spur one another on, as the NIV says, to love and good deeds.
Right.
Oh, but wait, it gets better.
Okay.
Let's back up and read one more verse. Let's read the whole context.
All right.
Because the whole context of this particular section in Hebrews chapter 10 starts off in verse 19 that says, since we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus. So in other words, because of the salvation that Jesus Christ has provided by his death on the cross, literally ripping the veil in the holy place in two, thus granting our access to God all over again, which we lost in the garden.
Right.
Because of that, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who has promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stimulate one another, and so on and so on. So in other words, because of the gospel, we want to encourage each other in Christ and spur one another on in love and to good deeds. And how do we do that? By gathering together and not forsaking the assembly. None of that has to do with guilt.
No.
All of it has to do with a general desire to encourage, edify, and build up each other.
Yep.
So this is an example. I like to do this. This is an example where a verse all by itself is damaging to the listener because of how it is spun.
Right.
But when you read this verse in context, it says something completely different than the ammunition that it's used as
Right.
to guilt people
Reading
into going
it
back
in
to church.
context, it's encouraging.
It's very encouraging. And I think that the folks who are flinging this verse in a guilt-ridden way are forgetting that spiritual abuse is the most offensive form of abuse, because it's almost like the only way that a person in a position of leadership is ever going to understand what they're going through is if there's some common frame of reference. Because, sweetheart, God forbid, God forbid that person in leadership, that there should ever come a day that they are spiritually abused, where someone hates their sermon.
Well, I think that
And starts a coup. Because you know what?
That does happen.
It does all the time. We've talked about that. Because, oh man, the world will have to stop for that person so that they can get the help and attention that they need.
Right.
I know this because I've been sought out by men in the pulpit who have been attacked like that. Now we have a common frame of reference. Now we can actually have a conversation about spiritual abuse. Is that the prerequisite?
It shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be, but it seems like it is.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's hard to have empathy.
Ooh, there's a dangerous Twitter word.
Yeah. It is?
Oh, yeah, but we're not going to go there. That was the
Empathy?
low-hanging fruit like 3 months ago.
Empathy?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Like we shouldn't have empathy?
There's a certain celebrity preacher who went on record as saying that it was a sin to show empathy. It's all part of that culture of perpetuating victim mentality.
Oh.
That if you show empathy towards somebody, you're perpetuating their victimhood. But
Well, that's not on us. That's on them.
right.
There's nothing wrong with showing empathy. If somebody chooses to be in a victim mentality,
That's their problem.
that's their problem.
Right. There's a difference between enabling victimhood and genuinely coming alongside someone with empathy and saying, hey, I get it. I'm here. Let me walk this with you.
Well, frankly, we need more people like that.
Well, that's what
Shame on that person.
that's what discipleship is.
Yeah. Shame on that person for thinking you shouldn't be empathetic.
There was a person years ago, much, much wiser than I, who said, it will never cease to amaze me how Christians are the only people group on the planet who kick their wounded.
Yeah, they do. What did Gandhi say? Sorry.
He said, Jesus, I love you, but save me from your followers.
Oh, and isn't there a verse that says that the world will know we're Christ's disciples by the way we love one another? Oh, but don't be empathetic, because that would be bad.
As a good buddy of mine would say, baby, that'll preach.
Yeah.
In a previous episode, not so long ago, in our series on State of the Steeple, Part 6, the episode titled, You Better Recognize, we talked about the Church of Sardis.
Yeah, okay.
And this was the church that got a little big for its britches, the church that was a little puffed up, the church that was not really paying attention, and there was an outside influence that crept in and basically took over, and the church destroyed itself from the inside. One of the points that I did not make in that episode that I want to make now. There is a question that I've been asked for a very, very long time, and that is, what do you think persecution of the church might look like in the United States of America?
Oh, I have an answer for that.
Well, what do you think?
We persecute ourselves.
That's exactly right. We are destroying ourselves from the inside out. I could sit here for the next hour. You know what? I might actually devote an entire episode to what's trending in Christianity right now. Because I tell you what, we are so busy splitting hairs over gobbledygook on social media that we've forgotten what Jesus told us to do, which is to go and make disciples, and we forgot what Paul told us to do, which is to preach the gospel, be ready in season and out of season, but we're putting all of that on hold for the sake of splitting hairs over stuff that does not matter.
Right.
And we're destroying ourselves from the inside out. And all of the while, what's actually trending in the church right now is deconstruction of faith and deconstruction of theology.
What does that mean?
Well, it literally is people being spiritually abused in the church. And they're throwing their hands up in the air and they're saying, first of all, I don't even know if I believe this crap anymore.
Ooh.
And they're literally going back to the drawing board and saying, well, what do I think about God? And what do I think about Jesus? And
what do I think about the Bible?
Exactly. And at the same time, there is this deconstruction of theology, which mainly focuses on people of, like, our kids' generation, the Gen Zers. Deconstructing their theology, which is really their parents' theology. Oh. They're saying, I don't know if I believe what my parents taught me. I don't know if I believe what my parents raised me to believe about all things theology. These are very, very serious things that are going on.
Well, now, that's one of the ripple effects from, like we were talking about earlier, and how
totally
church or spiritual abuse, the ripple effects is that it affects your whole family. And if your children see their parents being abused in the church, why would they want anything to do with that?
Or if your children are also being abused in the church, why would they want anything to do with that? It's exactly
and
right.
Like I've said before in previous episodes, church is supposed to be a place where you feel safest. If you can't be safe around your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, what is this world coming to?
Right.
I mean, the end is near. I mean, I'm going to put that on a cardboard sign and go stand out on the freeway.
Like that scene from The Stand. Yeah. It just seems like there is just so much noise and chaos out there that's just calling our attention away from the gospel, and it makes me sick to my stomach. It makes me absolutely nauseous.
You mean like all the stuff on social media?
Social media, it's just ridiculous.
It's distractions.
Totally distractions.
Yeah.
You know what, honey? I say it all the time.
What?
Christianity is so simple. Right? Like Christianity, you know what Christianity today makes me think of?
What?
It makes me think of television commercials. How's that? Well, like I remember this story that you told the kids once about the comparison of TV commercials when we were kids versus what they're like now. Do you remember that story?
To talk about
yeah,
it?
You remember that story?
Well, basically what I said to my kids was, back when I was a child and we watched commercials on television, imagine this, a little girl in a field in a meadow. The sun is peeking through the trees. There might be a little breeze going, a little butterfly, and she runs to this little swing, and she has a doll. And the doll might be dressed similar to her, and they swing on the swing, and then they lay down on the grass and look up at the sky together, and her dolly's like her best friend, and there's some soft music playing, and every kid, every girl and boy maybe even, wants this doll. But today, TV commercials, buy this toy, and you've got strobe lights going and kids falling on the ground having seizures. No offense to people that have seizures, but that should come with a warning label. These flashing lights, are just so distracting. And you've got this hard rock music, and you've got this image and that image and this image and that image, and it's all coming at you at once. And it's like the kids are sitting there catatonic, staring at the screen. And as the parent, I'm walking by, I'm like, what the heck is this?
Exactly.
And even if I could buy this toy, there is no way I would want to support this.
and ladies and gentlemen, that is what social media is like.
It's so.
And the thing of it is, and I've made no bones about the fact that I hate Facebook, but I've also made no bones about the fact that I love Twitter. As much of a cesspool as Twitter is, I love Twitter. And you know why I love Twitter? It's where I get all of my material for the podcast. Well, not all of it.
It is kind of interesting because I think a lot of the people, it's fun to look at Twitter because it does give me an idea of what the people in the church are talking about.
Yeah, it really does help get your finger on the pulse of the church. It really does.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, it's not about the gospel.
No.
It's not about promoting Christ. It's about all of these different ologies and isms and the latest and greatest thing that we're going to fight about. And here's a verse that supports it. And here's a historical church viewpoint on this that supports it. It reminds me of what Jesus said to the Pharisees in John chapter 5. He said, "You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life. And yet it is these that testify about me. It's as if he was saying, you spend all of this time poring over scripture, and I would add extra biblical reading material
Yeah, a lot of people.
to make your point and to be right, and you forget, you missed the boat, that the very stuff that you're reading and studying all points to me.
Yeah.
You've forgotten it. And as I said, Christianity, it should just be so much more simple. Why do Christians make Christianity so darn difficult? Because, when it comes to spiritual abuse, it should be so simple to deal with it. And when you have to leave the church because of the abuse and you have to lean on Jesus Christ, it's sad in a way that the only promise that you're left to rely on is Jesus' promise where he says, come to me and I will give you rest. It's not sad that you can rely on Jesus, but it's sad that you cannot any longer rely on his children, that you can't rely on fellow Christians and believers, because the abuse becomes unbearable. And when the leaders forsake and abandon victims, and when the people of influence in our lives leave us hanging, those are the times when it is necessary to retreat into the arms of Jesus Christ. Those are the times when it's necessary to just receive his rest and his comfort and his healing. And ultimately, it is comforting to remember that he will never leave you or forsake you. And that is all I have to say about that. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Churchosity Podcast, the show about the quality of being the church. And as always, thank you for my co-pilot being here, my amazing wife,
You're welcome.
the Mrs. Theological Coordinator. Make sure, especially if you enjoy the content, if you love listening to us talk and ramble and joke and laugh and get serious and ask tough questions, follow us on the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at Churchosity Pod. Drop us a message. Tell us your story. And even tell a friend to tell a friend what we're doing here on the Churchosity Podcast so that they can also be part of the conversation. But always remember, the goal of our instruction is love. From a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. So thank you once again for joining us. Thank you once again for listening. And until next time, this is the Theological Coordinator saying, peace.